is just dust and broken dreams. Which is why, last month, I found myself carrying this around Widnes town centre. And as I walked past a table with two elderly women, I heard one of them say to the other, "Where's he got them from?" And then, as I passed, "Excuse me, love, where'd you get them from?" I told her, "Asda's, £11.50. She nodded gravely, as if I'd passed on something important. And in a way, I had. Because when you've lived in Slovakia for nearly 30 years, £11.50 for 480 bags of Yorkshire tea isn't a bargain. It's a bloody lifesaver. To be clear, I am not saying that Britain is right and Slovakia is wrong about tea. And I'm also not saying that I'm any kind of connoisseur of fine teas. Absolutely not. I don't buy leaf tea and I wouldn't be able to tell an oolong from a Darjeeling. What I am saying is that for me, a proper cup of milky tea is just one of those things. You know how Slovaks abroad receive care packages from home containing mila and horálky, and how they'll take majka on holiday with them? Not because other countries don't have biscuits and meat paste, but because the alternatives just aren't right. To nie je ono. That's tea for me. And I think it's worth asking why. Why is tea so fundamental to British life? And why does Slovakia essentially not share that culture at all? Because the answer turns out to be genuinely interesting. First, a definition, because this came up in the comments on a previous video. When a British person says tea without qualification, they mean black tea from the Camellia sinensis plant with milk. Not herbal tea, not fruit tea, not green tea or white tea, not black tea without milk. If a British person wants fruit tea, they'll say, "Fruit tea, please." If they want Earl Grey with a squeeze of lemon, that's probably what they'll say. But if they just say tea, they mean one thing. Feeling tired? I'll make you a brew. Lost everything you own in a terrible fire? I'll put the kettle on. Broken 3 arms and dislocated your face? You just need a nice hot cup of tea. And this is not a joke. Tea is the answer to almost every situation in British life. And it has been for about 300 years. Here's why. Tea arrived in Britain from China in the 1600s. Expensive, exotic, initially a curiosity. The person who really established it as a fashionable drink was Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese queen of Charles II, who married him in 1662 and brought her tea-drinking habit with her. When the queen drinks something, the court follows, and eventually, so does the nation. But it was still expensive, and it had a competitor. Coffee had actually beaten tea to Britain by roughly a decade. The first coffee house opened in Oxford in 1650, and for a while it wasn't obvious which would win the nation's hearts. But by the mid-1700s, economics had settled the argument. Coffee relied on trade routes that were harder for Britain to control, so when demand rose, prices rose with it. Tea came from China, where the East India Company already had supply lines in place and could scale up imports quickly and cheaply. By 1750, tea had established its place as the British national drink, thanks as much to supply chain logistics as to anything else. What the East India Company still wanted, though, was independence from China. In the 1820s, a Scottish explorer called Robert Bruce came across a variety of the tea plant growing wild in the Assam region of India. The company developed it into a commercial crop, first in Assam and then in Ceylon, which is a modern-day Sri Lanka. But there was a problem. Assam tea, one of the key components of blends like Yorkshire tea, is much more robust than the delicate Chinese varieties. On the one hand, this is great. It survives the long journey. It survives being badly made. But it is full of tannin and other polyphenols, which make it astringent. You know, that kind of dry mouth feel you get from strong black tea. So, milk. Milk binds to the tannin, smooths the mouthfeel and makes it not just drinkable, but genuinely pleasant. That's the origin of milk in British tea. It's not arbitrary, it's chemistry. And here's something I didn't realise until I did the research for this episode. I always assumed that Indian chai, spiced milky tea, was the original, and that the British stripped out the spices and kept the milk. In fact, the opposite is true. Although the tea plant is native to India and was used by some indigenous tribes, it wasn't widely consumed across the subcontinent before the British arrived, and certainly not with milk. It was the British who popularised the practice of adding milk, and later encouraged tea drinking on a national scale to create a domestic market. What turned a national drink into a national obsession was the Industrial Revolution. Tea was now cheap, easy to make and genuinely useful, an alternative to drinking water, which in industrial cities was frequently unsafe. Boiling the water to make tea cut down on cholera and provided warmth, caffeine and a small moment of comfort in conditions that offered very few. So why doesn't Slovakia have the same relationship with tea? Partly because it was never part of the East India Company supply chain and underwent industrialisation much later. But more importantly, Slovakia had an earlier hot drink tradition that didn't really compete with coffee for the same role. The older tradition of fruit and herb infusions had been preserved in part through monastic and folk medicinal practices that endured in Central Europe, but which had been largely dismantled in Britain during the Reformation. They had always served a largely curative purpose. Lipovi chai, linden or lime blossom tea for stress, harmanchek and metta, chamomile and mint to settle your stomach, shipkovi chai, rosehip tea to fight inflammation. Not so much a social drink as a medicinal one. You can clearly see this in any Slovak supermarket. This is the tea aisle. That small section there, that's black tea. And everything else, fruit teas, herb teas, dozens of varieties, that's the real tradition in Slovakia. That's not a gap in the market. That's a different idea of what tea is for. Because the social role, the sitting down together, the Poďme na kávu, the working something out over a hot drink, in Slovakia belongs to coffee. And coffee here has its own history, rooted through completely different empires. Vienna's coffee house tradition spread across the whole Habsburg world, and Bratislava has long had a strong coffee culture as part of that legacy. Where Britain had the East India Company embedding tea into working life, Slovakia had centuries of coffee house culture embedding coffee into its social fabric. This brings me to one of my favourite drinks, Turecká káva. Despite the name, this Slovak coffee isn't exactly Turkish. It's made by pouring hot water over finely ground coffee. Its widespread popularity dates largely from the socialist or communist period, when it became a cheap and practical way to prepare coffee. No equipment, no fuss, just the right quantities, the right temperature water, and the right stirring technique. The other option in those days, if you could get it, was Neska, instant coffee, Nescafe. It was scarce enough to be a genuine luxury, and people gave jars of it as gifts, the ultimate thank you for a doctor or an official, a jar of freeze-dried status. When I arrived in 1998, that habit hadn't quite disappeared, which took some adjustment. In Britain, giving someone instant coffee as a present is either a very specific statement or a minor act of aggression. Here, it meant something. Though personally, I always preferred Turecká for what it's worth. So the picture in Slovakia is a curative herb tradition occupying one space, coffee occupying another, and no particular gap left for British-style black tea with milk to fill. Tea and coffee competed in Britain, and tea won on economics. In Slovakia, they were never really in the same race. Faced with a crisis, a Brit puts the kettle on. A Slovak says, Poďme na kávu. So what's it actually like trying to get a decent cup of tea in Slovakia? Cafes sometimes have something called English tea on the menu. This is usually a step in the right direction, but only a step. It tends to be weak and with milk only if you ask for it. My friend once offered me tea and it turned out there were two options. Something like Royal English tea, which was, let's say, optimistic in its self-description, and piggy chai. The official story is that it's named after a technical tea grade called Pigo. But let's be honest, if you're launching a tea brand in the 1960s and the biggest name in the tea world is PG Tips, you don't pick Piggy by accident. In any case, it's kind of drinkable with lemon and honey, but it's hard to escape the feeling that it's the sweepings from the factory floor. Needless to say, we ended up having coffee, and next time I brought him some proper tea bags. As for availability in the shops, it is now possible to order Yorkshire tea off the internet, though you pay a high markup. We generally bring it back from the UK. Where normal people have clothes in their suitcase, we have tea and Monster Munch. When I say we, I'm sad to say that my daughter has not yet adopted the tea drinking habit. She has, though, been trained from a very early age to make it for her parents. And then there's my wife. She spent nearly 30 years watching me make tea and has become, and I say this with complete seriousness, more particular about it than I am. Full builder's brew, very strong. The woman who grew up drinking Lipa and Harmanček now judges my tea. In the middle of the last century, George Orwell, yes, the author of 1984 and Animal Farm, amongst other things, wrote an essay called A Nice Cup of Tea, in which he laid out 11 rules for making the perfect cup. He insists, for example, on a warmed teapot, proper loose-leaf tea, no sugar, and pouring milk into the cup after the tea, not before. Conversely, my mate Andy Billingham swears you should put the milk in first to avoid scalding it. I respect both Orwell and Billingham, but I make my tea with a Yorkshire tea bag, boiling water, sugar and 30 seconds in the microwave. Let me explain. I'm not really a person who enjoys the process of making tea or coffee, but rather the product. I just want to sit down with my hot beverage as quickly as possible. Also, unlike my wife, I don't need to have particularly strong tea. And critically, I cannot stand lukewarm drinks. That's one reason I'm a fan of Turecká Káva. I can't stand paying €3 for a cup of coffee that's gone in 2 slurps. And there is little sadder than a half-finished cup of tea abandoned because it went cold part way through. The microwave solves all of this. Boiling water goes on the bag, the microwave keeps it hot while it brews, and the sugar and milk go in afterwards. The tea is at just the right temperature to sip when I sit down with it, and it stays hot long enough to finish it, and, if necessary, to dunk several biscuits, which is a separate and important science. If I want it stronger, I leave it for a minute before adding the milk. And that's it. That's the method. That's my dirty secret. Feel free to come at me in the comments. I think the honest conclusion here is a fairly simple one. It's easy to look at someone else's food or drink habits and call them strange, or wrong, or barbaric. But those habits, whether it's putting milk in black tea, or indeed my heretical shenanigans with the microwave, they almost always have a reason behind them. Tea with milk isn't random. It's chemistry, history, empire, industry, and about 300 years of habit, all in a mug. Slovakia has its own version of that, in the herb teas, the coffee culture, the traditions that came through monasteries and mountain villages, rather than East India Company supply chains. Neither is wrong. They're just different answers to different questions. But if you're ever in Asda and you see a man buying an irresponsible quantity of Yorkshire tea, that's probably me. And now you know why. The irony is that when I get home, my Slovak wife will no doubt tell me I haven't made it strong enough. I'm James Blore, and this has been the Blorecast. I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.